Welcome back to the OFFbit. Today we're going to be looking at the legendary Q6600 and we've married it up today with the GTX 260. We will be running our regular benchmark tests and running a handful of relevant titles for today. So stick around and find out how well this system can perform for us today. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Core 2 Quad Q6600. This CPU was introduced in January of 2007 based on the Kensfield 65nm architecture. With 4 cores clocked at 2.4 GHz and 8 MB of level 2 cache, its TDP requiring 95 watts, this CPU was a serious CPU for its day, and in our books, a legendary CPU for its time. This is our GTX 260. The NVIDIA GTX 260 was originally released on the 16th of June 2008. Based on the 55nm Tesla 200 series architecture. The version we have today is from Gigabyte. This is the GV-N260C-896i. The GPU has a stock clock of 650 MHz and has 896 MB of GDDR3 RAM. This GPU can suck up to 182 watts based from its TDP. The GTX 260 supports the following APIs: Microsoft DirectX 10, OpenCL 1.1, OpenGL 3.3, and it also supports PhysX. The motherboard we are using today is the G41MT-S2P from Gigabyte. Based on the 775 socketed platform, this board supports up to 8GB of DDR3 RAM, with supported frontside bus speeds of and up to 1333 MHz, and is a G41 chipset. The RAM we are using today is from Kingston. It's the KVR 1333D39K2/4G. This is a 4GB kit of DDR3 RAM at 1333 MHz, coming in a 2-stick combo. Finally, the drives we're using today are: we're using the standard drives as usual. Our operating system sits on the 120GB Western Digital Green SSD. We have a 256 Silicon Power SSD for games, and we also have a 1TB Western Digital Green magnetic drive as well for games. We are running Windows 10 build 1909. Let's move into the benchmarks. In 7-zip, the Q6600 had the weakest single core strength, coming close to the Q8400 at 2.6 GHz. This is exactly what we expected from this CPU. In the multi-core performance, we did score better than the i3-2120, but still, we fell behind all the other CPUs. In CPU ID, the Q6600 sat behind the Q8400 once again, but we did manage to pull out in front of the AMD FX 4100 in the single core performance. In the multi-core performance, we also managed to beat the FX 4100 and closely tailed the Q8400 and the i3-2120. The Q6600 in Cinebench R15 did land us in last place with a score of 243 points. We were not too far from the FX 4100 and the Q8400, but we weren't all that close either. This CPU really is starting to fall behind, but we should still be able to play some games today. The GTX 260 scored in Cinebench R15 a score of 42.91 frames per second. This card beat the GT430, the 450 and the 640. And for some reason, we also beat the GTX 570, which has a whole lot more GPU compute power, so I don't know what's happening there, so we'll just treat that as an anomaly and just ignore that. The Unigine Heaven benchmark gave us some really mixed results. The GTX 570 destroyed this benchmark, leaving everything else behind. However, the GTX 260 did do quite well in this benchmark, only getting beaten by the GTX 450 and the HD 6570. Finally, we ran 3D Mark's Cloudgate on the GTX 260. We do not have scores for the GTX 450 and the GT 640, unfortunately, but we can see it beat the HD 6570 and the GTX 430. The GTX 260 still packs somewhat of a punch for its age, though it does sit somewhere more towards the mid-range from the later generation video cards, which is great for its age, but bad on its power usage. If we were to compare the cards in that range to the power usage on the GTX 260, it wouldn't favour the GTX 260. Now the good news is, it really does look like we should be able to play some games with the GTX 260. So without any further ado, let's crack into our first game, GTA 5. In GTA 5, we felt that the GPU really did do alright, but the CPU on the other hand was much a different story. We ran this game at 1280 by 720 with low details. The game did suffer some massive load lag. The CPU really did struggle to keep up with loading in the world. Maybe if you were in some sort of stationary area or just not moving as fast across the map, that this may give you better results or a better playing experience. But what we tried, this basically was borderline unplayable at times, and that was not fun. The frame rates for GTA 5. Our average frame rate was 22.0 frames per second, minimum frame rates hit 0.4 frames per second, our maximum frame rate was only 30.2 frames per second, our 0.1% lows hit 0.4 frames per second. As you can see, we got some really low 0.1% lows. This is because of our load lag, which also affected our minimum frame rate quality harshly, and I do say it would have affected our average frame rate just as much as well. Look, I think with an overclock to 3GHz on this CPU, GTA 5 probably would be a lot more playable. But until then, if you're okay with a bit of load lag, and you could probably play GTA 5 on this system, but I would not recommend it. Alternatively, you could try much lower resolution to see if that would help your CPU, but I wouldn't be holding my breath. Moving on to Counter-Strike Global Offensive. CSGO we ran on medium settings at 1920 by 1080. This game ran almost perfect, though we did suffer a little bit of load lag. The funny thing is, it always seemed to happen on the last shot of the round. Unfortunately, we don't have any metrics that work to tell us exactly what the game ran like. However, we did see the game's FPS range generally between 30 FPS to 100 FPS, and we would say on average it sat about 55 to 60 frames per second. Combo of the hull with the GTX 260 and the 4GB RAM and the 4-core Q6600 for CSGO was very much adequate, giving us generally smooth gameplay and also giving us a pretty much enjoyable experience overall. So in our books, if you're running a GTX 260 with a Q6600, this game, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, is a thumbs up from us. Moving on to Minecraft Bedrock Edition. This game ran really well, though the CPU really had to work very hard, spending a large amount of the time sitting at 100% across all 4 cores of the Q6600. We ran Minecraft Bedrock Edition at 1920 by 1080 on default settings. Because of these high CPU loads, the game did have some issues with loading all the blocks in when we were moving around the world quite fast. This game would run much better if you did spend more of your time not running through the world in creative mode. So staying in single spots and walking around on foot would give you a much better gaming experience. This was obvious when we stopped in areas to explore some of the crevices or structures. We did notice that the CPU load really freed up at these points. Benchmarks for Minecraft Bedrock Editions. Average frame rate was 56.7 frames per second. Our minimum frame rates hit 31.9 frames per second. Our maximum frame rates hit 62.7 frames per second. And our 0.1% lows hit 12.6 frames per second. As we can see, the stats show that our PC did run this game quite fine, with 0.1% lows sitting only at 12.6 frames per second, which shows us that there was very little load lag happening here. The bottlenecks in this instance was more so on the CPU. However, at the current settings on our GPU, the GPU was not far off either from bottlenecking, especially in large areas with lots of detail. For this system, we gave Minecraft Bedrock Edition the thumbs up. Now, I'd like to point out, if you're running the Java edition of Minecraft, we think you would net a lot much worse results. So, if you're running a similar machine to our Q6600 with a GTX 260, we would highly recommend to use Minecraft Bedrock Edition. And just one last note, is that the current Minecraft Bedrock Edition is only possible to run through Windows 10 on PC. Finally, the last game on our list today that we could run is Blizzard's Diablo 3. We ran Diablo 3 on medium settings at 1920 by 1080. Diablo 3 really didn't give us any problems, running pretty close to perfect for the duration of our test. Now, if you're unaware what Diablo 3 is a fun hack and slash game, worth purchasing for machines that don't have the latest and greatest of hardware. The frame rates for Diablo 3. We got an average frame rate of 61.9 frames per second. Minimum frame rates hit 43.6 frames per second. Our maximum frame rates hit a high of 81.7 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows hit 18.2 frames per second. As the stat shows us, this game ran perfectly fine, with fairly good 0.1% low frame rates and a decent minimum frame rate of 43.6 frames per second. As the stat shows us, this game ran perfectly fine, with a fairly good 0.1% low frame rates and a decent minimum frame rate of 43.6 frames per second. We can highly recommend this title on the Q6600 paired up with our GTX 260. Now, our final thoughts on our system today. The Core 2 Quad Q6600, a legend of a CPU for its time. One of Intel's first quad cores, but today, it is really starting to slip away. We would recommend overclocking this CPU to get more out of it, and we feel that a 3 GHz overclock would open its range up of games, but still, this will only get you in the door with some of those games. So sadly, we think the Q6600 days are numbered, and if you can afford an upgrade to a newer quad-core CPU, this would definitely benefit you, especially if you overclock that CPU as well. Now, let's look at the GTX 260. The GTX 260, a great card for its time, but unfortunately, as all of the cards from the GeForce 200 series and before, they do not support DirectX 11. This and this alone is a big problem. There is a lot of games that require DirectX 11 just to even run. Here's a small list of a few games we did try, but we had DirectX 11 issues. We had Valorant, we had Fortnite, Sea of Thieves, and Rocket League. And sadly, some of these games, the GTX 260 has enough compute power, but alas, not the required APIs. No DirectX 11 support. So on this point alone, we can only say that the GTX 260 is pretty much seen its days of gaming and really can only be used in retro setups. As time goes on, we might just find that some of the games that we were able to run today will also probably need DirectX 11 with some update patches that will be added to these games somewhere down the track. Which of course in the overall, this means that the GTX 260 will eventually have even less games that it can run. That's all we got today for the OFFbit. Thanks once again for watching our video. Please stay tuned for our next video. If you liked today's video, please hit that like button. If you'd like to see more from us and you have not subscribed already, hit that subscribe button. And finally, feel free to leave a comment. We at the OFFbit love to see and we encourage a rich, friendly community environment. So, thank you once again, and we'll see you next time on the OFFbit.